Boker Tov. This is the Daf Yomi for Memhei and Memvav for Friday and Shabbos, because there's a way Shabbos at our yeshiva. So I'll try to record most of it now. So the Daf tells us we're going to start on Mem Daled Amud Beis. We're going to try to do 3 Dapim today. Mem Daled Amud Beis 44b, where the Gemara is in the middle of a discussion, a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbanan. In the Mishnah discussed a person who is muder hana from somebody else. So let's say Shimon's a lot of benefit from Reuven, and then they're in the desert, and Shimon needs to eat, and Reuven's got food. So the Rabbanan say Reuven can put the food on a rock and declared hefker, declared ownerless, and then Shimon can get it. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says that that's prohibited. Comes along Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan explains what's the reasoning behind Rabbi Yossi. The reasoning behind Rabbi Yossi is that Rabbi Yossi is at the position that until a person actually, even though he declares it hefker, until somebody else actually gets it, it's still in his position until somebody else claims it. And so therefore, it's just like he's giving a straight gift. It's like Reuven's giving a straight gift to Shimon, and therefore Rabbi Yossi said it's prohibited. Gemara in this context cited 2 braisos which seem to be contradictory to each other. The first brisa is of the position that if a person is mafkir his field, he declares his field ownerless, and the brisa says the first 3 days you can renege, but after 3 days you can't renege. And so therefore, in this context, that part of the brisa seems to be like the Rabbanan, that after 3 days you can't renege, means it's gone after 3 days. Whereas the next part of the brisa says that if a person makes something hefker for a period of time, then he's allowed to renege on it. And the Gemara tried to figure out, how do we understand this brisa? So Ua said that the last part of the brisa was the Rabbanan, who say that when you declare something hefker, it immediately goes away. But in this case, since you declared it only for a hefker for a period of time, therefore the Rabbanan rule, like Rabbi Yossi, it actually has to go into the other person's mind because it's a hefker garua, it's a diminished declaration of ownerless. Whereas Reish Lakish says no, that both positions are Rabbi Yossi. The first part is Rabbi Yossi, and the last part is Rabbi Yossi. So how come in the first part he says that it's? How come in the first part that he says after 3 days it goes away? So Reish Lakish says that this is because this is a rabbinic enactment, because we're concerned otherwise people forget about the laws of hefker, and then that will cause major problems with respect to tithing. So now in today's Daf Yomi, the Gemara on Mem Daled Amud Beis, the Gemara cited another brisa which seems to contradict it. The brisa says, Meisvei Amavkir as Carmel, somebody makes his vineyard ownerless, Shachar, but in the morning, not 3 days, in the morning he stands up and recants, Amadu Bitsaro, and he stands up and he harvests his grapes, meaning he takes away his ownerless declaration. He's still going to have to give all those tithes that relate to gleanings, like Shechcha and Peah, like in the forgotten field, the corner, he has to leave over. Upater min meiser, he's exempt from meiser, which means that it's like a property that was declared ownerless, because an ownerless property is exempt from meiser. So Gemara says, Bishlam, it makes sense according to Ula's interpretation of the first brisa, because what did Ula say? Ula said that it was like the Rabbanan, and so therefore the Rabbanan said it becomes ownerless right away. So therefore in the first brisa, he said, Bishlam the Rabbanan katanila udiaraisa katanila. The first brisa where it says that it becomes ownerless after 3 days, that was like the Rabbanan. But this brisa which says it becomes ownerless right away, that's biblically speaking. Ela Reish Lakish, according to Reish Lakish, who says that both the Reish and the statement of the previous brisa are like Rabbi Yossi. Then he said the Rabbanan made a decree after 3 days that it goes out. But here, why is it going out after 1 day? Am I patur min meiser? Why is he exempt from meiser after 1 day? Rabbi Yossi, according to Reish Lakish's explanation of the previous brisa, should require 3 days. So the Gemara says, well, what Reish Lakish say? Amro Chaki, Amriana, Rabbi Yossi, I said the earlier Bryce was like Rabbi Yossi, but how Rabbanan? But this Bryce about Mafkir Karo, it's not a contradictory Bryce. It's our Bryce that argues with it. That's allowed. You can have two Bryces, and this is like the Rabbanan who said it becomes Hefker right away. That's the first answer. Now on our daf, what do we say on our daf? Alternatively, top of 45a. Ha the Afkare Ba'ampe train. Ha the Afkare Ba'ampe Tlas. It depends the nature in which you made it Hefker. If you made it Hefker in front of two people, then Reish Lakish says Rabbi Yossi would say that since not everybody knows about it, it takes 3 days in order to make it Hefker. But if you made it Hefker, and that's like by the case in the wilderness, and that's why Rabbi Yossi says in the case of the wilderness, it's prohibited to do it that way because the Hefker was just those two people by themselves. But if you make the Hefker in front of three people, in front of three, then it becomes Hefker immediately because then everybody knows about it. You have to make something Hefker. Yeah, if you really want it to be something that you can't recant, it has to be made a declaration in front of three people. But if you just do it in front of two people, that's not going to be considered like an ownerless declaration. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Devar Torah, that actually, biblically speaking, really, biblically speaking, just one is required. Why do they require three? And the three is just technically speaking, so that one person can claim and the other two people can testify. But biblically speaking, the declaration of Hefker is just required. Even one is sufficient. So, and that's how the Rambam learns in Hilchos Nedarim. The Rambam learns that rabbinically speaking, you need three people in order to make a declaration of Hefker. We should just say that. What about when we make our chametz Hefker? When we make our chametz Hefker, that's not really making it Hefker. That's a lesser form of ownerlessness. So we don't require this extensive declaration in front of three. So now we're up to the Hadron Alach Ein Bein Amuda. We finished this beautiful fourth chapter. Now we're up to the fifth chapter. Fifth chapter begins with the sugya of Breira. Breira is one of the sugyas that is a Shas sugya. It's throughout Shas that appears in Beitza and Baba Kama and Baba Basra. So this beautiful topic of Breira is whether or not an event that's happening now can clarify something that really happened a long time ago or in the past. Meaning to say, we want to know now that we see that this has happened, can we use this to shed light on what had been the status of something previously? So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the following case. Hashutfin Shenadro Anaz. So there are two partners, says the Mishnah Memham base, two partners that each took a vow that they're not allowed to get benefit from each other. So then under those circumstances, they're not going to be allowed to go into the joint courtyard that they own because each one is going to prohibit the other one to walk into his courtyard because we pass like Rabbi Elazar who says Vitor. Now we care about walking into the courtyard, even something so insignificant as that. And so therefore, he's of the position that we're going to say, the Rabbanar of the position that we say Ein Breira, meaning to say we don't say that now that even though they said, okay, we're sharing the courtyard, they purchased it, and then presumably each one has rights to it on certain hours, certain days, certain moments. And now that we're walking in, the Rabbanan say we can't use this principle of Breira to say, if Reuven and Shimon can't benefit from each other, the moment Reuven walks in, well, now it's become retroactively clear that Reuven had the courtyard rights to the courtyard for that specific moment. No, the Rabbanan say we can't say that, and we're not looking at. By the way, this sugya seems to be inconsistent with other approaches to Breira in the Talmud, but we'll leave that aside because we're just focusing on this stuff. So therefore, the Rabbanan say we don't say Breira. They say Breira is prohibited. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Zen Nechnas l'toch shalov, Zen Nechnas l'toch shalov. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says each one can go into their own courtyard. Zen Nechnas l'toch shalov, Zen Nechnas l'toch shalov. Each one can go into their own courtyard because Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov is of the position of Breira. He says that, well, now that they're walking in, it's become very clear that that at that moment, that was when he had purchased a courtyard for, and he's not actually benefiting from his friend. That's what we call the position of Breira. So I'll read the Tosfos here. Tosfos says a little bit different. So Tosfos says to sever the H prayer of high b'didei kamahalach, high b'didei kamahalach. And so that each one is walking in their own courtyard. So Tosfos then writes, it's certainly is prohibited to spread out his fruits in the whole courtyard. But to walk in it, he's going to be allowed. Because you could say, because you could say in every place that he walks, that's his portion. So Tosfos sounds like he's saying that you can't do the whole thing all at once, because then it's certainly not your right for that. But you could say, well, this was the moment that I had purchased it. So that's Daf Mem Hey. Now on Daf Mem Vav, the Mishnah continues, Ushneim Asurim Lahamid Rechayim Vitanor Ugadel Tarnagoim. And both of them are prohibited to set up a mill in the courtyard and an oven and to raise these chickens. So what's the reason? That now I'll go to the Russian's explanation. The Bakal Hani in all of these three cases, the mill, the chickens, in both these cases, the mill, the oven, and the chickens, each partner could, technically speaking, prevent the other one from putting it up. Like that's what we say in Baba Basra and Chaskas Sabatim in Nun Zayin. Now, therefore, it's not similar to the case of walking, says the explanation of the Rosh, because you're always allowed to walk in your courtyard, and so therefore we can't allow it because of the concept of brera. Because he could say, I don't abide when it comes to these things. Each partner, technically speaking, could stop it. If they object, even though they generally speaking wouldn't object to these things, if they would object, they would be able to stop it. And even though most people waive their objection, that's called vitur, and so vitur is prohibited. Now the Mishnah is going to repeat something. We could have learned that from the previous law, but because when set up the next case, it repeats it. Let's say one of them was not allowed to benefit from the other one. Then he's not allowed to go into the courtyard because it's his courtyard. Of course, he can't go in. So, but Rebbe Lezer and Yaakov says, Yachohu Omarlo L'toch Shali Ani Nechnas. So he's allowed. So this is a case where only one of them was prohibited. If both of them are prohibited, they're allowed to go in. And for sure, if only one of them is prohibited, Rebbe Lezer and Yaakov would allow him to go in, because he could say, I'm going into my portion. And I'm not going into yours. The kofanes hanoder chorus or as hanudar, the Gemara is going to discuss it. We forced the one who is vowed, who's not allowed to enter, to sell his portion. We'll see who's being forced in a few moments. We'll see in the Mishnah who's being forced to sell. So we forced the vower to sell. Let's say there's somebody from the marketplace, mudar be'echad mehem. Then if there's somebody from the marketplace and he was not allowed to have benefit from one of the owners, well, he's not allowed to go into the courtyard. Rabbi Lezer and Yaakov says, Yaakov Omer, well, he could say to him, it's just like brera works between two partners. It works here too. He could say, I'm not going into yours, I'm going into the partners, and therefore it's okay. Let's say somebody's not allowed to benefit from the other one. V'yeshlo merchatz, ubeis habad, muskarim ba'ir, and he has a bathhouse and he's got an olive press, but they're rented out in the city. So Shimon's not allowed to benefit from Reuven. Reuven happens to have a bathhouse. He happens to have an olive press, but he rents it out. Can Shimon go in? Im yeshlo ba'en tfisas yad, if he has tfisas yad on it, if he has control over it, if he has the way he rents it out, that he still constrains the ability to go in there whenever he wants and use it. So then even though it's rented to other people, it's going to be prohibited for him to use it. So the Gemara is going to discuss what exactly is this tfisas yad. And so if he still has tfisas yad, it's prohibited for the one who's not allowed to benefit from the owner to use it. But if there's no tfisas yad on it, we're going to say it is permitted. Somebody who says to his friend Konem Ubeis, and we just had this part of the mission was just cited 4 days ago, so I'm sure it sounds familiar. So somebody says to his friend Konem Ubeis Shani Nechnas V'Sadcha Shani Lokeach. Somebody says to his friend he says, I take a vow that I'm not going into your house or your field. I'm not going into your house or I'm not going into your field. Under those circumstances, he's mace. Let's say the person who he says this to dies, or he sells it to somebody, or sells it to somebody else, mutter. Because then he's going to be allowed to go in, because he only prohibited your field or your house. So therefore, if he sells it or he dies, it's not his anymore. But if he says kolim bayzeh shani nechnas sadazu shani lokeach, he says, I'm not going to buy this field, I'm not going to enter into this house. And then, but then if the person dies or he sells it, it's prohibited. Why? Because he didn't say your house or your field, he said the house or the field. So therefore, that's the mission. So now we come to the Gemara. So the Gemara has the following question. If each one of them prohibited, we'll read what the Mefarsh says here. The Mefarsh says, in a case where each one of them prohibited each other from getting benefit, do we say that's the case where the Rabbanan say you're not allowed to go into the courtyard? Because he himself made the vow, the Iu Atzmo, because who the Kasar Rabbanan Kasar, the Iu Atzmo Ka'asar way, although he dirus it, but let's say the case where Reuven doesn't say, I'm not allowed to get benefit from you, or Shimon says, I'm not allowed to get benefit from you, that's where the Rabbanan say you can't go into the courtyard. But let's say, let's say they each said the other one is prohibited. Reuven says to Shimon, you can't get benefit from me. It's not that Reuven said about himself, I can't get benefit from Shimon, but where Reuven says to Shimon, you can't enter into my courtyard, and Shimon says, you can't get any benefit from me. So under those circumstances, the Travayu Anusim, both of them, both Reuven and Shimon, they didn't do anything. The other guy just says, you're not allowed to get benefit from me. Basically, Reuven and Shimon prohibited Reuven and Shimon without their knowledge. The Rabbanan agree with Rabbi Eliezer that each one could go into his courtyard or not. So that's the question. Basically, they're partners, and each one said, "Oh, you can't go into my courtyard." Are the Rabbanan still arguing there? So that's the question. The Gemara. Obviously, in the case where the vow happened, they made the vow themselves on themselves. They argued the Rabbanan, but he dirus et zemai. But let's say the owner, the partner tried to prohibit the other partner from coming in. Do they still argue? Amrina do say ben nidra hu de puigi, where they vowed upon themselves, that's prohibited. But where each one of the other partners tried to prohibit the other one, we would say Modu or Rabbanan or Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. There, the Rabbanan admit that we say Breira and you can go into the courtyard. Because it happened against their will. Or maybe we say that even where they made the vow against each other, they're going to be considered arguing. So the Gemara says, Shmuel is trying to answer it. So we had the case in the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said on the top of 46a, not the first case of the Mishnah, but after it lists the case of the oven, the mills, and the chickens. It said if one of them was prohibited to get benefit from his friend, he's not allowed to get into the courtyard, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov allows it. So there it says, it says if one of them was not allowed to get a benefit from the friend, and the sages still say that he is not allowed to go in. But from the fact that the Mishnah says mudar means he didn't vow himself, but rather Reuven said to Shimon, "You're not allowed to get benefit from me," and he's still not allowed to go in. So we see that the Rabbanan argue in both places. Pligi Rabbanan. Gemara says, "No, Tani nadur mechaver. Don't use the word mudar. Use the word nadur. He took the vow upon himself." Nadur mechaver hana. And this indeed is logical to say it's where he took the value upon himself. The Katani Seifa, because the next clause of the Mishnah says, "If the kofin has a no derim koras chalka," we force the person who took the vow to sell a share. Now, if you want to say that he made the vow and that's why we force him to sell, hire the Katani kofin. That's why we can force him to sell. You made a vow that you can't benefit, and now you want to go into the courtyard. No, we're going to force you to sell to get out of that halachically problematic situation. Eli Amr is the Adre, but if you say no, one of the partners vow that the other person can't benefit from me, am I kofino? So why would we force him to sell? Mainas Unis, he did his vow, he was vowed upon. He didn't make the vow, he was under duress. So therefore, in that circumstance, we wouldn't make the person who was vowed upon, we wouldn't force him to sell. So that's the first dispute. That's the first approach, that the dispute is only in a case where he took the vow upon himself, but if he was vowed upon, then the Rabbanon would agree that he could go in with Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, that would say Brera. But Amar Rabba, Amar Zeiri, he says Machlokes, so he says a new idea. He says on the top of 46b, when do we say there's a Machlokes? When is there a dispute? Sheyesh ba kedei chaluka, where the courtyard is big enough that you could take this portion of the courtyard and divide it into two parts. Each partner will get a half, and they'll each have a remaining part of four amos. Under these circumstances, the Chachamim say we're not going to allow you to go into the courtyard because because of reason of brera, because it's possible that maybe in the future the courtyard will be divided. And so therefore, since in the future, the courtyard will be divided, we're not going to say that when you use this courtyard now, it's become clear that retroactively that when the feel that when you made a partner, that part was yours. Because you could say that after they divided it, after they'll divide the field, they'll be able to see which part they are now. But if the courtyard is so small that it's never going to be divided in the future, and so therefore it's always going to remain in this state of partnership, everybody would say it's permitted. Meaning to say, we'll read what the Ran says, the rabbis prohibited only in a circumstance where it's big enough to be divided up, because they're of the position that they say ain brera, and the rabbis say we don't say brera under that circumstance. And we're not going to say it's become clear that when you use it, the we're not going to say when you use it, it's clear that this was the part that you really bought, because since this courtyard could eventually be divided, you shouldn't keep it sheyesh but din chaluka b'shas kniyasa, and therefore when you acquired it, it hasn't become clear that you can use which part, because maybe it's never going to be divided, and since it eventually could be divided, maybe it's never been divided. Whereas if there is not enough to divide it, then it's become clear that this is that under those circumstances we'll say brera. So Amalei Rav Yosef says to him, "All right, Beisa Knesses, the Kamisha Ein Bo Kedei Chalukah Dami." A synagogue will never be divided because all the people need the synagogue. A synagogue is like something that can never be divided. Utanan Shashnein Asurim B'Davar Shalosa here, and we're going to learn later on in the Mishnah that if it's something that's related to the synagogue were going to say, that means to say they're both going to be prohibited in something that relates to the city. And the Mishnah says that one of the things that belongs to the city, if two people say that they're not going to have any benefit from each other, they're not allowed to benefit from something that belongs to the whole city. And what is that? That is a synagogue. And we see from here that a synagogue is she'ein bo chalukah, is like something that can't be divided. And they're not going, and they're both going to be prohibited. So this is the Rabbanan say even in a situation where it can't be divided, it's prohibited. So the Gemara answers, it's just the opposite. The dispute between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Elazar and Yaakov is only when there's no chalukah. The Rabbanan say it's prohibited, like the Mishnah on Memches. But if it is able to be divided, then even Rabbi Elazar and Yaakov would say we don't say prayer under those circumstances because eventually it'd be divided. And Amar Avuna, Allah Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Allah Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, that we would say it's brera under these circumstances, and they're allowed to enter into its courtyard. Okay, we'll stop here. This is the Daf Yomi for Shabbos on Friday, and God willing, on Sunday morning we'll do the Daf Yomi